That's my book. And I think it sometimes helps in thinking about new technologies, first of all, to think about old technologies. That, for younger members of the audience, is called a printing press. And it's worth thinking what a printing press was. And the key thing about a printing press was that not many people had them. So mostly they were owned by very rich men who owned newspapers. And because there were not many of them, if you owned a printing press, that gave you immense power. And any journalist over the age of 40 who worked in a time when that was the main piece of technology will tell you what a lovely time it was. We were almost literally on a platform above our readers. We had the monopoly of news, the monopoly of distributing news. We almost handed it down to the readers, and they handed up their money. And sometimes journalists of a certain age can't quite see what an extraordinary moment that was to have one of those. And the revolution that I describe in this book, I think, is as big as the previous revolution involving a printing press in the 15th century. And one of the purposes of writing this book was just to describe what that revolution feels like. To live in the middle of a revolution is exhilarating but also terrifying. And you have no idea where it's going, or in some cases what you're doing. And it was like that in the 15th century, and it's been like that for the last 25 years. In writing the book, I drew a little map, and I'm going to show a couple of slides which will explain to you why I never became a graphic artist. So these are very crude slides, but that was a map of my time at The Guardian. And down in the pink were all the stories that we were writing. And at the top, there were the kind of reorganizations that all newspapers do. This was what we were doing digitally, so we thought we were pretty good in trying to stay ahead of the digital curve and interpreting the technologies of the day. But see what was happening round about then, round about 2006. Just in the space of 6 months, Facebook, Twitter, and the iPhone were invented. And we were still wasting time thinking about print. And that's what a revolution is like. You have no idea. When somebody came through my door and said there's this thing called Twitter, and it's going to be bigger, the biggest news organization in the world, I looked at it, and I just couldn't see it. It was full of people talking about what they'd eaten for breakfast, and I couldn't see what it had to do with news. And Facebook seemed an interesting thing. I said to all the senior journalists on The Guardian, go and use Facebook because our children are using Facebook. But it never occurred to me that it would have anything to do with news. So it's very hard when you're in the middle of a revolution to see these things that are going to end up either making your life or destroying your life. And there are things that will be happening at the moment, and it could be to do with artificial intelligence. It could be to do with the blockchain. I don't know. There will be things happening now that when we look back, we'll think, how on earth did we not see that happening? But I think the big trend we do understand. And the big trend is the change from a society that was arranged vertically. So we had the printing press and you didn't. So we handed down the truth to you. You handed up your money to us. And that was not just in journalism, but that was a whole arrangement of society. And we now have 4 billion people moving on a horizontal plane like that. And 4 billion people with the ability to publish to each other and to talk to each other is such an enormous revolution for society, for democracy, for communication, for government, for politics, for science, for law, for everything. And we're only 5 minutes into this, so we can't understand it. And it's particularly hard if you were living in that world to work out how you get into that world there and have any relevance or any trust or any purchase on that world. There's a historian in Britain that's just written a book about this, Niall Ferguson. He's a historian on the right, but he's written a book called The Tower and the Square, and it's the same idea of the difference between these kinds of hierarchical societies and these kind of much more level societies. Now, you may hate this, you may love it, but I think it's what's happening, and I think it's unlikely to change in the near future. So if you're thinking about journalism, or if you're editing at the moment, this will be the thing that will be preoccupying you. How can we understand this horizontal layer? And it would have been an easy book to write, and it would be easy today to come along and talk about all the things that are wrong with social media. We could all do that. We can all say how lying they are, how rotten they are, how they don't pay their taxes, and I would agree with all that. But that misses something, and it misses that extraordinary growth in Facebook. You know, there it was in 2008, when I had been editing by then for 13 years, and by the time I stopped editing, now it's something like 2 billion people, so about 1 in 2 of everybody who has access to an internet terminal. So they must be doing something right. I know they've had a horrible year, and they've behaved badly, and the shine has come off them a bit. But any media company that is doing something like that is doing something right. Just as the general trend for newspapers is going in the opposite direction. So we're doing something wrong, and they're doing something right. And in trying to write this book, I found myself stepping back and asking bigger and bigger questions about what we're doing, including what is journalism, what is news, who gets to be a journalist. And there were 2 particularly interesting questions that occurred to me that I think we have to be sure that we're getting right. So the first is, are we better than the internet? Because the internet is such a prodigious, amazing machine for communication, that if we're not better than the internet, then we might as well give up and go home. And that's, I think, quite a complicated question, because in order to understand that chart there, what is it that they like? Some of it is to do with the tone of voice that exists. So it's not handing down a tablet of stone. It's people who are prepared to listen to each other and to talk and be a little more tentative and to have something that's more like a conversation. So there are ways that people treat each other with respect, and again, I could do the lecture about how people are horrible on Twitter and Facebook and so on. But nevertheless, it's something that we have to be sure that we know the answer to that. And the second question is, are we in journalism, are we primarily a business, or are we primarily existing as a public service? And I think that's quite a complicated question as well. And you might say the ideal answer is that you're both. And there are some news organizations that are lucky enough to be able to combine that. But I see an awful lot of news organizations that really get stuck on this because the business model that used to exist when you had the printing press is not going to be the business model that exists in the future for a more conversational, more level style of communication. And sometimes I think we may have to completely rethink that question. And I'm not here to lecture you today to say that I've got the perfect answer, or to say that the answer will be the same for all newspapers. It won't be. But nevertheless, I think we have to begin by thinking about those 2 questions. So I began writing this book in 2016, and again, I thought it would be an easier book to write than it was, because I thought, well, I've been a journalist for 40 years, the answer to all our problems is journalism. If we could just have more journalism as a response to this chaos of information that exists, then that would be great. And I found it difficult to write that book, partly because of what was going on in Britain at the time. And I was no longer editing, but I was a reader, and I knew what I wanted from journalism. And what I wanted was journalism to explain to me something that I instinctively felt was a very complicated question, in or out. Didn't seem to me a simple question. And I needed to be able to be presented with all the arguments in order to make my mind up as a citizen. That's what I wanted journalism to do. And that's, by and large, what journalism did. So that's what the British popular press did. That's how they reported Brexit. So they said, no, actually, this isn't a complicated question. This is a very simple question, and we're only going to give you one side of the argument. And by the way, we're going to use our front page to demonize migrants or to tell you which way to vote. That was the overwhelming balance of the argument. And at the Reuters Institute, they did some work and found that the pro-Leave press was twice as powerful as the pro-Remain press. So if this was the biggest question that Britain had faced in 3 generations, and this was the moment for journalism to prove that it was better than the internet, I don't think journalism did a very good job. And all kinds of funny things began to start happening. So this was the man who owns the Daily Express. Before he owned the Daily Express, he owned a magazine called Asian Babes. So he's essentially a pornographer who bought a very conservative mid-market paper, and that's him signing a cheque for £1 million to give to the head of the UK Independence Party. So this was a proprietor saying, well, I own the printing press, I'm going to give one political party £1 million, and so I'm not going to pretend that I don't have an opinion or that my paper is going to give you both sides of the argument. You had The Sun, which is the biggest tabloid in Britain, owned by Rupert Murdoch, which eventually had to register as part of the campaign to leave, because it was printing a big poster for people to put in their window. So it had stopped doing journalism and started doing something else. And then you saw an awful lot of front pages which were incredibly aggressive. Remember, this was a campaign in which an MP had been murdered, and you would have thought that editors would have choked back their outrage and their fury and their bullying and these threats. Ignore the will of the people at your peril, and yet that's not what they did. And you got a series of front pages, some of which were completely wrong. That story turned out to be completely wrong, and there were other stories that were wrong as these newspapers got angrier and angrier and were working on the level of simplicity and on the level of emotion to try and force their will on people, as they had done in the age when they had the printing press. We will hand down the truth to you, and you must do what we say. So that was one reason where I thought, okay, I want to argue that journalism is the answer, but what kind of journalism? And that the second issue that made me think was climate change. So there's a man you'll never have heard of there called James Delingpole. Has anybody ever heard of James Delingpole? No reason why you should. James Delingpole is the climate change correspondent of Breitbart. Everybody knows what Breitbart is. So Breitbart, a very right-wing, it exists on the internet. It's part of the information chaos. And James Delingpole, who studied English at Oxford, I'm afraid, That's what he thinks about climate change. He doesn't think that it exists. He's completely frank about it, and he says, this is a revolution. We have truth and justice on our side. We owe the enemy nothing. We shouldn't count our job done till we've crushed them, seen them driven before us, and heard the lamentations of their women. So you can see he's like Boris Johnson or P.G. Woodhouse. He has a light style, but as journalists we would say climate change is probably the most important issue of our lives, and the way we would prove that we as newspapers are better than the internet is that we would never employ James Delingpole. He would be the last person we would go to write about climate change. We all agree? Yeah. Okay, so try putting James Delingpole into a search engine. And this is what happens. He's all over the British press. He's writing for The Spectator, for The Mail, for The Telegraph, for The Express, for The Sun, and all their associated international titles. So there's something there that I just can't explain. I don't understand it. If, you know, we're living at a moment of existential crisis for the press. There's a tide of information out there which is full of James Delingpoles, and yet we're trying to say we're the press, we're better, and our survival depends on convincing you that we're better, and yet we use people like that. Now, maybe the Italian press is much better than the British press, and this never happens in the Italian press, but this was what I was thinking. And I was thinking about the difference between the media we have and the media that we need. And that seemed to me a really, that aspect of media that we need is the crucial thing that we need to think about. And we need to think about it especially at a time when the media is so under attack from people like the President of the United States downwards, or in his case upwards, of people who in normal circumstances would be the greatest defenders of the press. Now we can see how this is, what this is doing to trust, and luckily Italy is doing rather better than the UK, but there's the UK and countries like Sweden. But nevertheless, the levels of trust in the press are now very, very low. And there are now 50% of people who are disengaged from the news. And even more alarmingly, we've got now 2/3 of people who can't tell the difference between a good news source and a bad news source. So this inability to explain why we're so much better, and for people to convince people that we're so much better, is turning into really a dangerous situation in which people now think, well, actually, we can't tell the difference. And this is obviously becomes accentuated in a feed, if you're getting your feed via Apple or by Facebook, when some of the typographical distinctiveness of a newspaper or the separateness of a newspaper site would have been something that would have helped decide. And I was thinking, why have we got this confusion? And again, terrible graphic about to come. This was an attempt to draw all the things that we mean by news. And it's quite difficult. You've got people who are very opinionated and very campaigny and very adversarial, and this sort of advocacy news. And then you've got people who are the opposite over here, who are very straight. In America, if you go to journalism school, you will be taught that objectivity is the thing. You ask any British journalist if objectivity exists, they'll tell you objectivity doesn't exist. So we can't even agree after 300 years of doing journalism what our craft is or what we're trying to tell people about this system that we have of journalism that explains why we are the answer to the problem that exists. By the way, I think we are the answer, but I'm just trying to think it through from the point of view of the reader rather than the point of view of the producer. And this gets to the heart of this question about what our main motivation for doing this is. So are we really in it for the money, and nothing wrong with that. I like making money, and I think it's good for news organizations to be profitable if they can. But is that now becoming an and/or question in which the public interest and our ability to convince people that we are working in the public interest, and for them to believe that, which end of that are we beginning? And as I say, that there are some newspapers, if I was editing the Financial Times, I would be trying to create a completely different business model from the Sun. So I thought I would talk a bit about how we thought about this. So The Guardian is not owned by anybody. It's a rather unusual paper. It was owned for years, for centuries, by the Scott family. They gave the paper away in the 1930s and created a trust to endow the paper and its journalism. So the money just goes back into the business. I just thought I'd talk about some of the stories that we did to explain how we thought about the tension between the accountants who had the job of making the paper solvent and the journalists who were trying to do journalism in the public interest. And phone hacking was one of the stories that we did. You know, we exposed a corporate cover-up in the largest private media company in the world about criminal behavior in the newsroom. Now, that story took 7 years to produce. And you think, how on earth could you convince any accountant that it was worth this man spending 7 years of his life and me as an editor supporting him? That's Nick Davis, yeah. Absolutely wonderful reporter.
We invited him to come. He's going to come next
spring. Oh, right, okay.
spring.
So, well, listen to him very carefully. He's the greatest reporter I worked with. Just a fantastic reporter. Now, that story ended up with the Prime Minister's press secretary, as he then was. This was a man who edited the News of the World at the time. All the phones were being hacked. And that's a very clever picture because it looks as though he's in prison, doesn't it? I think he was just walking past some iron railings. Though, funnily enough, he did end up in prison as a result of our stories, but it took 7 years in order for that to happen. And so that was another thing I wanted to do with this book, was to explain, Marius talked a bit about this already, that if you take on power, power will come after you. And your journalism has to be right, and you have to be able to defend it, because if you can't defend it, there's no point in writing the story in the first place. So there's something about the institutional weight and power of journalism that seems to me, you have to describe that before it goes and say, look, there is something here that we have to treasure and preserve and pay for. That was a man who was going around effectively killing people in Africa by selling them rubbish drugs that didn't work for HIV. That cost us £500,000 when he sued us. This was our crime correspondent who wrote about corrupt policemen. They sued us. We risked hundreds of thousands of pounds for that. There's another man we sent to jail. He was a cabinet minister called Jonathan Aitken. And that was one of the headlines I most enjoyed writing, because it was very, very simple, but told the truth very effectively. And there was another headline I enjoyed writing, a liar and a cheat, about another minister in a government. This was a bank that we took on who went to court to try and stop us publishing documents in the middle of the night. And then there was the British Security Services. She's not actually the head of the British Security, but you may have seen films in which she's, you wouldn't recognize, anyway, she's a very bad woman to upset, because if you upset her, that's what she does to your computers. So she comes into the Guardian offices and says, we have to smash up your computers, otherwise terrible things will happen to you. So that was very unpleasant, but perhaps not as unpleasant as that one. A bad man to upset, and that 7-year battle to do that story was very tough and unpleasant. We did something about tax avoidance, and we worked over all those companies who were avoiding tax. And there was a very tricky moment when I had to go to the head of advertising and say, I should just tell you that we're going to be writing about all these companies tomorrow. And he went a bit white and he said, but they're all our biggest advertisers. But he didn't blink. But there's a chapter in the book that describes that the Daily Telegraph, a company in which the commercial department had effectively taken over the editorial department. And that was another form of corruption. We did a story about undercover policemen whose job was to get into campaigning organizations in order to form relationships with women, and sometimes fathering their children, sometimes marrying them, and then when the job came out, was ended, they just walked out of these women's lives, and the women never saw them again. An incredibly difficult story. So the point of this is not to do the Guardian's greatest hits. Well, it slightly is. These are journalists who were kidnapped or got deported or disappeared or were expelled. And that's another part of the journalist's job. And then you have to work with strange people sometimes. That was a story that took 20 years to uncover. This was a story that you may have read about that involved crowdsourcing a man who had died in a demonstration outside the G20 protests, and the police said that he'd had a heart attack, and it turned out to be a lie. He hadn't had a heart attack. He'd been attacked by a policeman. So the point of this is, these were great journalistic stories, I think. Some of them we did with our readers, this mantra in which our readers know more than we do, one of these things that people began to say in the middle of this revolution. But there was no strict economic rationale. So we were definitely doing these stories because we believed and they were in the public interest. And sometimes we did them without much support from the rest of the British press. In the middle of the Snowden allegations, there was a definite mood from some elements of the British press to try and send me to jail. And luckily, that hasn't happened yet. But the point is, it would have been a great deal easier to do that kind of journalism. And the accountants might have been happier, and we could have done that with a much smaller staff. And we wouldn't be upsetting all those powerful people. We wouldn't be spending millions on 7-year investigations, fighting libel courts, getting journalists out of trouble. But it wouldn't be in the public interest. Now, how do you tie all this together? Well, I think, actually, we underestimate our readers, and that on some level, if you look at Hollywood and all the mythic films about journalism, there is a feeling that this is what journalists should do. They shouldn't do cat videos. They should do really difficult stuff that confronts power and takes enormous risks and courage amongst reporters in order to do this thing we call journalism. And it's the public interest bit of confronting power that actually the public thinks is important. Now, how does this translate into a business model? So our readers aren't extremely rich. That's one advert in the Financial Times. They had this incredible section called How to Spend It, which was sort of intended as a bit of a joke, but our readers are so rich, we will tell them how to spend it. And how to spend it makes an enormous amount of money for the Financial Times. there's one watch that costs £23,000, which coincidentally is exactly the same as most Guardian readers earn. So we don't have the luxury of being able to go to immensely affluent watch manufacturers and building a magazine around luxury goods. So we had to think of a different model. And the thing we knew about editing in the middle of a revolution was that you have to build the audience before you'll get the money. That's classically what Amazon has done. So Amazon has built an enormous audience while not making almost any money at all. So suddenly, after about 20 years, they suddenly begin to make money. But that's Jeff Bezos saying, actually, what I want to do is to build the scale, and then we'll have the money. So in order to do this, you have to be very long-term in your thinking. And the poor old accountants who are sitting there thinking, how can I pay for all this journalism? It's going to ruin us. Have to understand that that is basically the picture that you're going to try and describe. And luckily, the Guardian chart didn't quite take off like that, but it wasn't bad. It was, compared with the chart that I showed you to begin with, which was newspaper sales going down like that. So there are now, I think, an audience of 160 million people come to The Guardian every month, 160 million. And when I started editing, it was 400,000 who were buying it in print. So the scale of what's happening is now enormous. And you've got a complete contrast, and this is what we've known was going to happen for 20 years. You could have drawn these lines that would show that print was going to go like that and digital was going to go like that. And around about 2007, we invited all the readers into the building. I thought, you can't leave the readers out of this. We're going to have to bring the readers into the building and explain to them that there's going to be a period of extreme turbulence over the next 10 years. And we're going to have to think about, if you value The Guardian enough, we're going to have to think about how to do this. And one model is obviously to put up paywall around your content and say, you can read The Guardian if you pay us, and then no one else will be able to do it. But is there a better way of doing that? And it was Clay Shirky, the professor at NYU, who was writing brilliant books about the internet 10 years ago, who had a session with all the Guardian readers, and he asked them, and he said, well, what do you want? Do you want to put the Guardian behind a wall, or do you want to pay for it to be available to everybody? And this is a model that is not unique to us. It's essentially the Wikipedia model. It's National Public Radio, this Dutch magazine, which has just this week opened in America. They asked for donations to their correspondent in America. In 2 days, they had £500,000. ProPublica, the Marshall Project. There are now different models of funding journalism in the public interest that are now beginning to surface. And for The Guardian, we had this idea of saying, well, instead of just subscribers or just readers, would you like to become members of The Guardian? And you can argue that that is a vague enough term to keep everybody happy. But if we haven't got a proprietor, then they have a sort of sense of ownership of the content and of the paper. And that was where they were a few months ago, and as of last week, they've now got 1 million readers who are paying for The Guardian. And that is entirely voluntary. So we're not saying you must pay, otherwise you can't read it. We're saying, would you like to pay for The Guardian to be available to everybody? Now that seems to me an incredibly important thing to be able to ask people. It's saying, if you believe in journalism as much as we do, and you believe that journalism is a force for the public interest, and that the world needs facts, it needs reliable information, because we can see with Trump and other countries we won't mention today, that if you can't even agree on a factual basis for society, then society can't work. You can't have government, you can't have law, you can't have science if you can't agree what the facts are. So this is Guardian readers saying, well, we agree with that. The Guardian, thanks to the trust, also has £1 billion in the bank to help support the endowment, and they say they're going to break even this year. So touch wood, and nothing is forever, but at the moment, the Guardian has done something, I think, rather remarkable by taking a very long-term view of journalism and saying, yes, it is worth supporting a 7-year investigation defending it, because in the end, what you're doing is you're telling your readers about your values and about the kind of things that you think journalism are. You're defining journalism for the readers. The kind of long-term thinking this is required, so we opened up in Guardian Australia. That was an interesting model. It was a philanthropist gave us the money to do that because he was so worried by the domination of Rupert Murdoch in America, in Australia. And he said, look, if you can't make this profitable, that's fine. I'll just write the model, the sums off, because I believe in journalism as a cause. And actually, after 5 years, it's now making money. The same kind of picture when we went into America. We had to lose money for a long time, and now it's breaking even. That was the chart that we did back in about 2014 of what we thought would happen to membership. We thought we would be earning 30 million and be making 15 million profit. In fact, it's much better than that now. And that's the Nick Davis story of 7 years. So there is no shortcut in this world of technology. We have to be patient, think long term, and realize that we have in a way to educate the readers in terms of what we're doing. And I just want to tell a little story about why this matters. And it sort of, sometimes I use the term open journalism, and people will say, is that the same as free journalism? Well, it's not quite the same. The same, I quote Dean Baquet in the editor of the New York Times in my book. We had a dinner in which everyone said, well, the New York Times paywall is great, and it's one of the most successful paywalls in one of the richest cities in the richest country in the world. So if they can't do it, then nobody could do it. But at this dinner I was at, he said, I worry about the 98% of Americans who don't read the New York Times. So you're creating a society where if you have the money, you can be very well informed. If you don't have the money, then you have to make do with Fox News or whatever else is on the telly. So while I was writing the book, I had this bad habit of writing and having Twitter open at the same time. And that tweet came to me via somebody else, and it had this graphic detail there about, so this was essentially a tweet in Sweden saying that actually the Muslims come in and they rape our women, and they not only rape them, but they are barbaric. And then look at that last sentence, mainstream media is quiet, retweet. And it was such a sort of horrible image that it was very difficult to just go back and write my book. And I thought about it, and then I thought, well, I wonder where that story is going. And if you went on to Reddit, this was a huge subject of conversation with people saying the most awful things about what this meant about immigration and about Muslims. And so this was causing a huge stir. And I thought, well, I wonder who this guy, Peter Sweden, is. And it didn't take long to discover he believes in things like that. I'm pretty certain the Holocaust actually never happened. But nevertheless, that had been retweeted 17,000 times by the time that I got to it. So I went on Twitter and I said, hey, Swedish journalists, why are you being quiet about this? You know, surely this is a story that needs reporting. And all the journalists I know in Sweden said, but he's talking rubbish, we've all reported it. And there's Peter Wolodarski, a great editor in Sweden. Many journalists are working on the story. And people sent me links. And every time they sent me a link, I ended up on a page like that, inviting me to pay, or a page like that, inviting me to take out a subscription. So it was true that mainstream media had reported this story, but people couldn't read it. Meanwhile, they had left the playing field open to any old neo-Nazi to come in and tell any lies they wanted about this story. And you know what happened in Sweden in the last election. And you know what's happening in all these countries now when that horizontal movement of information is happening. And when journalism says, well, actually, we're not going to be there. We're doing our work, but it's going to be over here. And by all means, read any old rubbish you like, because self-evidently, we're better than that. Again, I'm not saying that that business model is terrible, but you can see what that does to society if you say, well, our business model involves walling off our information and letting society believe what they like, because that's not how we conceive our notion of the public interest. And I think where this is going to lead, because it's not certain that the market will provide and will sustain the kind of public interest journalism that society needs, the difference between the media that we have and the media that we need, that we may begin to start thinking of different kinds of companies. In Canada yesterday, the government of Ottawa announced that they were going to start subsidizing certain forms of media. When I was talking in Sweden recently, I had dinner with two Swedish editors, and one was the leading editor and one was not the leading editor. And the person who was not the leading editor was subsidized by the Swedish government, who thought that actually it was a bad idea to have just one dominant paper. So that subsidy model is one, and there are lots of journalists who would hate that, though the BBC is a kind of subsidy model and is easily the most trusted news organization in Britain, if not the world. But maybe we need to start thinking about news organizations who are essentially social enterprises, and say, look, this is what that's what a social enterprise looks like. It's something in which you say, well, look, our mission is not primarily profit. If we can make profit, that's great. Our mission is really the public interest, and this is how we think we can fulfill the public interest. I think the public is ready for that conversation and would welcome journalism that recommitted itself to an idea of the public interest as they understood it. And that would take an awful lot of conversations between journalists and their readers and the wider public to understand exactly what they meant by that. You sometimes, when people are saying Facebook should pay us because we're doing proper journalism, I've had conversations with Facebook executives who say, well, okay, we're prepared to entertain that, but what does this journalism look like? Does it look like the Daily Mail? Does it look like those front pages about Brexit? Is that journalism? Or is there another kind of journalism that you think we should be supplying? And I think plan A, if you're working for a conventional company, will be definitely to try and make the profits and to make all the sums add up. But it would be stupid not to have a plan B that says, well, okay, it may be that we may need to start from a different kind of place. So that's more or less me. I'll just tell you how the story ended for me. I got called up in front of the House of Commons, and when I did the Snowden story, a lot of MPs found it hard to believe that you could be a patriot and write about Edward Snowden at the same time, and I was asked that rather extraordinary question. The Guardian computer stock suffered an awful lot of damage, as I've described. I got played by Doctor Who in The Fifth Estate, which was the first film that was made about the Guardian journalism. I got to play myself in the second film about Guardian journalism, the Oliver Stone movie about Edward Snowden. And then somebody bought the rights to the phone hacking story. I think if he went to the gym, he could play me quite well. So George Clooney is working on the phone hacking film. That was a very nice moment, getting the Pulitzer Prize for the Snowden film. But the most extraordinary thing that happened to me was when this arrived in the post one day, and it was Darmstadt's leading protest band, I'm sure you've all heard of them, Woog Riots, had made an album called Alan Rusbridger. And this is what it sounds like. Oh, it's gone. I can't tell you what it sounds like. I don't think I can tell you because this is the bit that didn't work. But if you go back and Google Woog Riots and Alan Rusbridger, it's a really good song. Oh, there it is. Can we have some sound?
Can we have some sound? C'è l'audio? No. L'audio?
You'll just have to imagine it. Anyway, it was one of the most bizarre moments, actually finding there's a song and the opening words are, oh, how exciting.
No, sull'HDMI.
It is not essential. It was just a joke to end up with. So there you are. Breaking news, the remaking of journalism, and some of the questions that I think we're going to have to answer in the next few years.